Hello everyone. Today we will explore a disaster, or as some might call it, a case with a massive number of victims. This event exposed serious flaws and became a lasting stain on South Korea. It is the Sewol Ferry disaster. Off the southwestern coast of South Korea lies a beautiful island called Jeju. In 2014, 325 students from Danwon High School in Incheon were preparing for a 4-day school trip. They planned to travel by ferry from Incheon Port to Jeju Island. At that time, a large ferry was docked at Incheon Port. This ferry had previously been owned by Japan's Oshima Shipping Company, had been in service for 18 years, and had never experienced any major incidents before. Later, the ferry was purchased by Chunghaejin Marine Company. The company's chairman, Yoo Byung-yoon, renamed the ship Sewol, meaning beyond the world. From the name, it was clear that Chairman Yoo had high expectations for the vessel. Renovating an old ferry was a major project. Under his direct supervision, the Sewol Ferry was expanded to include additional cabins. The ship had 5 decks. The first and second decks were for cargo, the third and fourth decks were for passengers, and the 5th deck housed the bridge and crew quarters. Chairman Yoo, a photography enthusiast, also added an art gallery at the bow of the ship to showcase his personal works. After renovations, the Sewol Ferry had a total length of 481 feet, a width of 73 feet, and a height of 46 feet. It had a displacement of 6,825 tons, a maximum capacity of 960 passengers, and could carry 987 tons of cargo. It was the largest ferry of its kind in South Korea. On March 15, 2013, the Sewol Ferry officially entered service, operating 3 times a week between Incheon Port and Jeju Island. The schedule was carefully planned. It would typically depart from Incheon at 6:30 p.m. and arrive at Jeju Island at 8 a.m. the next morning. Passengers could enjoy a full night's sleep on board without delaying their travel plans. In the spring of 2014, over 300 second-year students from Danwon High School in Ansan boarded buses bound for Incheon Port, excited for their ferry trip. None of them could have imagined that they were about to experience one of the worst maritime disasters of the century. On April 15, 2014, a Tuesday, the Danwon High School students arrived early at Incheon Port. They lined up, pushing suitcases of all sizes, preparing to board the Ohimana, the ferry originally scheduled for their trip. However, the weather conditions were unfavorable. A sudden thick fog enveloped the port before departure, drastically reducing visibility over the sea. For safety reasons, the Air Traffic Control Center issued a warning and suspended all nighttime ferry departures. 10 ships were quickly called back to port and forced to halt their journeys. The students, unaware of the unfolding situation, passed the time chatting, gazing at the fog-covered sea and hoping the mist would clear soon. By 8:30 p.m., the dense fog gradually lifted and the weather improved. Perhaps for safety reasons, the Ohimana ferry remained docked. The students grew anxious, eagerly awaiting their long-anticipated departure. As unease spread, one of the ships scheduled to set sail that night was the large Sewol Ferry, a vessel similar in design and size to the Ohimana, operated by the same company. Since the Sewol Ferry was carrying a large amount of cargo, it needed to reach Jeju Island as soon as possible and requested immediate departure. After reassessing the weather conditions, the Air Traffic Control Center lifted the restrictions, making Sewol the only passenger ferry allowed to set sail that night. At that time, over 100 passengers had already boarded the ship, but there were still plenty of empty cabins, enough to accommodate the students and teachers from Danwon High School. To avoid disrupting their travel schedule for the following day, after discussing with the captain, the school temporarily decided to transfer from the Ohimana ferry to the Sewol Ferry to reach Jeju Island. Upon hearing the good news, the students cheered in excitement. Everyone called or texted their parents to inform them about the change. Over 300 students, pushing colorful suitcases of various sizes, eagerly boarded the Sewol Ferry, filled with anticipation. For most of them, this was their first time traveling on such a large passenger ferry. They curiously looked around at everything. Some mischievous students couldn't resist tapping on the railings, creating loud noises. Everyone was chatting, laughing, and enjoying the experience. Under the guidance of their chaperones, the students went up to the fourth deck. The empty cabins had been specially reserved for Danwon High School students. The teachers stayed on the fifth deck with the crew, while individual passengers were assigned to the third deck. The students lined up as they walked down the long corridor of the fourth deck cabins. The cabins were arranged along both sides of the hallway. Each cabin had windows that provided a clear view of the ocean outside. Every room contained 8 beds, arranged in a bunk style similar to college dormitories. Though the passage inside was somewhat narrow, it was neat and uncluttered, with no unnecessary decorations. The students were pleased with their accommodations. Some quickly unpacked their belongings, while others lay down on the beds or gazed at the sea through the windows. Meanwhile, the crew was making the final preparations before departure. Unlike the lively atmosphere inside the cabins, the port was quiet that night, with only the sound of the ship's engine and the gentle waves breaking the silence. Although a thin layer of fog still hovered over the sea, the Sewol Ferry had been granted permission to pass through. The anchor was slowly lifted, and everything was ready for departure. As the ship's horn echoed, the ferry gradually left Incheon port, heading toward Jeju Island. Watching the coastline fade into the distance, the students in the cabins grew more excited. South Korea's education system is highly rigorous, and students must study diligently every day. This trip was a rare opportunity for them to relax and enjoy themselves. After the ship set sail, some students went up to the deck to feel the cool night breeze from the ocean. Others wandered around the ship, taking pictures to capture memories. Some stayed in their cabins, snacking and chatting, while others turned off the lights and listened to ghost stories in their bunks. The main hall on the third deck was lively. 2 Filipino singers performed live music for the passengers. The soothing melodies echoed throughout the hall as everyone raised their glasses to toast a successful journey. At 10 p.m., all passengers were invited to the ship's deck to watch a spectacular fireworks display. The dazzling bursts of color lit up the night sky, dispelling any worries the students might have had. The next day happened to be a teacher's birthday, so the students stayed up late to prepare a surprise. At midnight, they eagerly brought out a cake to celebrate, capturing the joyful moment with photos. In the dark of night, the Sewol Ferry was the only thing glowing. Gradually, everyone drifted off to sleep. At 8:30 a.m., the students began waking up one by one. Some headed to the main hall on the third deck for breakfast. The sea was calm, and the journey was more than halfway complete. According to schedule, the ferry was expected to arrive at Jeju Island in 2 hours. However, something unexpected happened. At 8:48 a.m., the students inside the cabin suddenly felt the ship violently shake. At the same time, shipping containers on the deck began falling into the ocean, crashing into the water with a deafening noise, sending waves splashing aggressively against both sides of the ship. Even more terrifying was that 10 seconds after the shaking started, the ship still had not regained its balance. By that point, the entire vessel had tilted 30 degrees to the left. In the third-floor dining hall, passengers eating breakfast fell to the ground like dominoes. Inside the cabins, people and belongings were thrown to one side. The narrow hallways quickly became packed with fallen passengers, many of whom were injured. A second-year student from Danwon High School, Choi Deok-ha, was in the fourth-floor hallway when the sudden tilt threw him to the ground. He immediately sensed that something was wrong. At 8:52 a.m., 4 minutes after the incident, he grabbed his phone and called 119, South Korea's emergency hotline. Normally a calm and composed boy, Choi Deok-ha did not easily panic in emergencies. But this time, he was shaking and flustered. He struggled to suppress his fear and explain as much as possible to the emergency operator about what was happening on the ship. Worried that he hadn't explained clearly enough, he handed the phone to a teacher nearby. But to his surprise, the teacher was even more terrified. She couldn't remain calm, repeatedly screaming for help without providing any useful information to the operator. The phone was handed back to Choi. Once the emergency operator understood the basic situation, they transferred the call to the Mokpo Coast Guard station, which was closest to the ferry's location. Mokpo is a port city in southern South Korea, and the site of the accident fell under its jurisdiction. The Coast Guard mistakenly assumed that Choi Dae-ka was part of the crew and kept asking him technical questions about latitude, longitude, and his exact location. Confused but desperate, Choi tried his best to describe the situation and repeatedly emphasized that there were over 300 students on board and that they needed immediate rescue. What's important to note is that Choi Dae-ka was the first person on the Sewol Ferry to send a distress signal to the outside world, even before the ship's crew did. Shortly after, while he was still pleading for help, the ship's intercom suddenly broadcasted a message. This announcement was repeated at least 10 times over the next hour after the accident. 3 minutes after Choi Dae-ka sent his distress call, First Mate Kang Won-sik finally sent an emergency signal to Jeju Air Traffic Control, requesting them to alert the Coast Guard for rescue operations. After several delays, at 8:59 a.m., they finally made contact with the Mokpo Coast Guard. Before this, the Coast Guard had already received a distress call from Choi Dae-ka and had dispatched a patrol boat for rescue. Inside the cabins, students were confused and disoriented, struggling to get back on their feet after falling. Following the intercom announcement instructing everyone to stay put, the students felt slightly reassured. With their teachers offering comfort, their fear gradually subsided. They didn't dare move freely, believing that the ship would soon stabilize. The atmosphere inside the cabins was gloomy, and the ship remained tilted. Suddenly, someone laughed and spoke, breaking the eerie silence. More students began joking lightheartedly, trying to lift each other's spirits while they optimistically waited for rescue. At 9:07 a.m., 19 minutes after the accident, the Jindo Port Traffic Control Center, which was closest to the Sewol Ferry, received a request for assistance from First Mate Kang Won-sik. They instructed the crew to immediately inform all passengers to put on life jackets and prepare for evacuation. At 9:13 a.m., 25 minutes after the accident, instead of stabilizing, the ship's tilt worsened significantly. By this point, the ship had tilted beyond 50 degrees, yet no rescue team had arrived. Strangely, the ship's intercom continued to repeat instructions for passengers to remain in place, emphasizing that the teachers and students of Danwon High School should not act rashly. No additional evacuation instructions were given. Inside the cabins, fear began to take over. With the help of their teachers, the students put on life jackets one by one. Standing upright in the hallway was no longer possible. The students were nearly pressed against the walls, growing more terrified by the minute. Half an hour after the accident, one student spotted a red passenger ship through the window. Its arrival ignited hope among the trapped passengers. As more rescue ships approached, students began messaging each other through Kakao Talk to spread the news. Some even burst into tears of relief. The red passenger ship was Dura Ace, the closest vessel to the site of the accident. After receiving the distress call from Jindo Traffic Control, it immediately rushed to the scene at full speed. It was the first ship to arrive at the site. By this time, containers that had fallen from the Sewol Ferry were floating all around, blocking Dura Ace's approach. The captain of Dura Ace provided life jackets and lifeboats, getting as close to the Sewol as possible. However, the Sewol's crew made no attempt to organize an evacuation. The massive deck was completely empty. No passengers were being evacuated. 5 minutes after arriving, Dura Ace reported the situation to Jindo Traffic Control, urging the Sewol's crew to begin evacuating passengers. However, First Mate Kang Won-sik claimed that the ship's broadcasting system had malfunctioned. He also expressed concerns that if passengers evacuated too soon, they might not be rescued in time. Despite multiple reassurances from Jindo Traffic Control, the crew still did not organize an evacuation. Instead, they continued instructing passengers to remain inside their cabins. 2 minutes later, Jindo Traffic Control once again demanded that Captain Lee Jun-seok make an immediate decision on whether to evacuate, but he did not respond. He only repeated the ship's condition. During this time, the crew continued using the radio to instruct passengers not to move. The fog still surrounded the area, and an ominous atmosphere filled the ship. At 9:32 a.m., several civilian vessels arrived at the scene to assist with the rescue. Under Jindo Traffic Control's coordination, these ships deployed lifeboats for passengers. The Mokpo Coast Guard's patrol vessel number 123 and helicopter B-511 also arrived at the site. However, none of them made direct contact with the sinking ship, nor did anyone attempt to enter the cabins. Meanwhile, the passengers remained inside, following the intercom instructions, too afraid to go outside. The rescue operation appeared bizarre. The teams failed to coordinate effectively, and no one seemed to understand each other's intentions. Some rescue vessels circled the Sewol Ferry aimlessly, unable to begin the evacuation. They could only watch helplessly as the massive ship continued tilting into the sea. At 9:35 a.m., 47 minutes had passed, yet water had not yet entered the cabins. Numerous boats surrounded the scene, and if someone had ordered an evacuation, passengers would have had a high chance of survival. But in reality, that did not happen. As time passed, the Danwon High School students grew increasingly terrified. Within less than a minute, the situation rapidly worsened. Suddenly, water surged onto the third deck, flooding the hallways and cabins. The ferry tilted further to the left, reaching a 62-degree angle. Screams and cries filled the hallways. 2 teachers were tragically swept away by the rising water. Facing death, the students broke down emotionally. Some frantically called their parents, their voices barely coherent. Some parents received text messages from their children, dropped everything they were doing, and prayed desperately for their safe return. Amidst the roaring sounds of rushing seawater, the ship's intercom continued broadcasting, but no rescuers entered the cabins. Some passengers realized they could no longer sit still and wait for death. As they began running for their lives, the ship's tilting speed increased. At 9:37 a.m., Captain Lee Jun-seok made his final report on the ship's tilt to Jindo Traffic Control. After that, all communication between the outside world and the Sewol Ferry was lost. At that moment, 3 Coast Guard teams maneuvered small rubber boats through the floating containers, carefully navigating the debris-filled waters to get closer to the ship. 10 minutes later, the rescue boats successfully reached the ferry's deck. At 9:48 a.m., the rescue team successfully evacuated the first group of trapped individuals. However, they were not passengers. They were 8 crew members, including Captain Lee Jun-seok. At 9:54 a.m., the left side of the ferry was completely submerged. The students continued following the intercom instructions, waiting for rescue. Some, however, acted on instinct, realizing they needed to escape while they still could. They tried to navigate the hallways, searching for a way out. With the help of a kind-hearted passenger, some students climbed onto the deck using lifeline ropes, waiting for the rescue helicopters to arrive. By then, the ship had tilted more than 70 degrees. Meanwhile, several students were still trapped in the third-floor main hall. Seawater crashed against the windows and poured in continuously. Among those trapped were adults, students, and small children. Because of the severe tilt, the floor of the hall was nearly vertical, forming a 90-degree angle with the sea. The only way to escape was to grab a fire hose and climb up nearly 65 feet. Some passengers desperately climbed to safety, while others were helped by brave individuals. Unfortunately, some were too weak to escape in time. Within minutes, seawater rushed into the hall, engulfing a large number of passengers. At the time of the incident, a fisheries patrol officer named Park Seung-gi was on duty, monitoring illegal fishing boats in waters 25 miles away. When he heard about the Sewol Ferry disaster, he immediately redirected his vessel, the Jeollanam-do number 201, and rushed to the scene at full speed. By the time he arrived, 76 minutes had passed since the disaster began. What he saw shocked him beyond belief. He later recalled, "I saw the Sewol Ferry almost completely overturned. 2 helicopters hovered above, and more than 20 ships surrounded the area. But none of them were moving. No one was making any attempt to rescue the passengers." Without hesitation, he steered his vessel toward the sinking ship, noticing a large group of passengers waiting at the stern. Risking his own safety, he boarded the ferry and, along with his colleagues, managed to rescue 28 people. His patrol ship, Jeollanam-do number 201, activated its emergency lights. Seeing this, more than 20 nearby civilian fishing boats, which had been waiting passively, mistakenly assumed that an official government rescue operation had begun. This misunderstanding spurred them into action. One by one, they approached the ferry and started evacuating passengers. In the next 15 minutes, these civilian fishing boats collectively rescued 120 people. At 10:15 a.m., some passengers managed to reach the deck. By this time, the ferry had tilted beyond 90 degrees and was on the verge of capsizing. In a desperate last attempt to survive, some passengers gathered all their courage and jumped into the freezing water. By then, hope had almost completely faded. People were too cold and terrified to even cry. At 10:17 a.m., the situation deteriorated rapidly. The ferry passed the vertical position and completely capsized, leaving only the right side visible above the water. The students inside the cabins finally realized that the intercom was no longer working. Within seconds, seawater rushed onto the fourth deck. 40 students who had been waiting there took their last chance to escape, using all their strength to swim toward nearby rescue boats. All of them were saved. But the remaining students were not so fortunate. The pressure of the water sealed their cabin doors shut, and their last opportunity to escape was gone. Inside the cabin, only the sounds of rushing water and desperate screams remained. The students banged on windows, crying for help. Some used their cell phones to send final messages to their parents. One student texted, "The ship is sinking. Mom, Dad, I want to see you." That was the last message a parent received before losing all contact with their child. After capsizing, the ferry slowly began sinking into the sea. At that moment, any nearby ships or rescue teams that got too close risked being pulled down by the suction. At 10:18 a.m., the Coast Guard took full control of the scene, prohibiting any other ships from approaching. 92 minutes after the initial accident, the Sewol Ferry was fully overturned. Fisheries officer Park Seung-gi scanned the sea, but could not find any more passengers. Just as he was about to leave the scene, he suddenly heard a desperate cry for help. Looking closely, he spotted a male student wearing a life jacket, shouting with all his remaining strength. He was near the wrecked ferry, at risk of being sucked underwater at any moment. Taking a huge risk, Park quickly changed course, steering his boat toward the student at full speed. Just minutes after the ferry sank, he successfully rescued the last known survivor, Park Jun-hyuk, a second-year student from Danwon High School. When the ferry capsized, Park Jun-hyuk was still trapped inside and unable to escape. He had tried to help a female classmate, struggling against the rushing water. When the ferry flipped upside down, he lost all sense of direction. With the cabin rapidly filling with water, he made a life-or-death decision to fight for survival. Both students took a deep breath and dove underwater, trying to swim against the sinking currents. However, the strong suction from the ferry pulled them apart. After 10 seconds of struggling underwater, Park miraculously escaped, surfacing just as the ship disappeared into the dark ocean. But the girl never resurfaced. At 11:18 a.m., 58 minutes after capsizing, the ferry was almost completely submerged, with only the spherical bow still visible above the waterline. After the disaster, various government agencies launched response efforts. However, dozens of organizations operated without a clear chain of command. There was confusion over jurisdiction, no accurate updates on the rescue operation's progress, and overall chaos. At 10 a.m., while passengers were using their last strength to escape, South Korean President Park Geun-hye was notified of the accident, but then disappeared from public view. At 11 a.m., as the ferry was nearly fully submerged, the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters reported to the Blue House that there were no casualties. At 11:01 a.m., NBC Broadcasting Corporation led the news coverage, reporting that there were no casualties on board. Many other media outlets followed, spreading the false report that all passengers were safe. This misinformation lasted for 49 minutes, delaying public awareness of the true scale of the disaster. Some parents cried tears of joy upon hearing the news that all students on board had been rescued. They immediately tried calling their children's cell phones but received no response. Only the final messages from their children remained on the screen. This deepened their anxiety, and their hearts sank. It wasn't long before they realized something was wrong. When the false reports were exposed, public outrage quickly escalated. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures. Headquarters admitted to providing false information, claiming that they were unaware of the true situation on board. Meanwhile, rescue efforts at sea remained chaotic. At 12:04 p.m., a naval rescue team specializing in shipwreck recovery finally arrived at the scene. However, they did not have diving equipment and were unable to conduct underwater rescues, leaving them helplessly waiting near the wreckage. At 1:42 p.m., the Coast Guard's deep-sea diving special forces finally arrived, but due to strong ocean currents, the rescue mission could not begin. At 5:15 p.m., President Park Geun-hye finally appeared in public. She was completely unaware that hundreds of students were still trapped inside the ferry and expressed shock that rescue efforts had made no progress. Upon arriving at the National Security Office in Seoul, she even asked, "I heard all the students were wearing life jackets. Why is it so hard to find them?" It was clear that she still did not grasp the gravity of the situation. At 6 p.m., the first underwater rescue attempt was finally launched. However, only 4 divers, 2 from the Coast Guard and 2 from the Navy, were deployed. The entire operation lasted only 10 minutes, and no one was rescued. Despite this, the government falsely claimed that 118 Coast Guard officers and 42 Navy personnel had been deployed. When this lie was exposed, public anger erupted once again. At 10:20 p.m., another underwater search mission was attempted. This time, 1 crew member and 1 high school student were found with signs of life. However, their heartbeats were weak, and the student passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. That night, his parents stayed awake in fear, unable to sleep. In the early morning hours, Prime Minister Yoon Hong-won gathered the families of the missing at a gymnasium in Jindo and called for a press conference to address the concerns of the victims' families. However, grief and frustration quickly turned into anger. Furious parents rushed forward, surrounding him, creating a scene of chaos. The Coast Guard announced that nighttime search operations would soon begin, claiming they would pump air into the cabins to increase passengers' chances of survival. But the parents had lost all trust in the government. That night, they refused to wait any longer and rushed to Jindo Port, demanding to witness the rescue efforts in person, despite attempts to stop them. Throughout the night, Coast Guard vessels remained stationed near the wreck site, but no one was allowed to conduct rescue operations without official approval. Officials claimed that over 500 divers had been deployed, but many parents could not even see a single diver near the ferry. According to media reports, a total of 14 bodies were recovered on the first day. 2 days after the accident, on April 18, 2014, the entire ferry was completely submerged. As more time passed, many civilian divers, unable to remain idle, volunteered to join the rescue mission, but they were blocked by the Coast Guard and were not even allowed near the ship. Government agencies and news outlets continued to spread false reports, which were repeatedly debunked. 3 days after the disaster, there was still no real progress in the rescue efforts. What was even more infuriating was that the ship's captain and several crew members, driven by their own survival instincts, abandoned the passengers and focused only on escaping themselves. This intensified the outrage and frustration of the victims' families, pushing their grief and anger to the limit. They no longer trusted any explanations from the authorities and were left feeling completely helpless and devastated. It wasn't until April 19, 2014, that rescue operations were finally taken seriously. The Coast Guard, Navy, and civilian divers all participated in the mission. By 4 a.m., the rescue team had set up 3 guide ropes to facilitate underwater search efforts. An hour and a half later, divers reached the seafloor. There, the massive Sewol Ferry lay silently before them. The eerie silence inside the cabins left the divers in shock. Families of the victims, gathered inside a gymnasium in Jindo, watched the underwater search live broadcast. Many broke down in tears, unable to bear the sight. Some parents chartered a squid fishing boat and traveled to the site where the ferry sank. The ocean was empty, and all they could do was weep for their lost children. A total of 49 bodies were recovered that day, and search efforts continued until November 11, 2014. The recovery operation lasted for 209 days, but out of 476 passengers on board, only 172 survived. The remaining 304 either perished or remained missing. Among the victims was Choi Dae-ok, the second-year Danwon High School student who was the first to call for help. This tragedy became the deadliest maritime disaster in South Korean history. A year after the incident, in August 2015, the South Korean government signed an official contract with Shanghai Salvage Company to recover the Sewol Ferry at a cost of $91.6 billion, won approximately $63 million USD. However, the salvage operation was far more difficult than expected. The actual cost skyrocketed to $280 billion, won approximately $193 million US dollars, far exceeding the initial estimate, and the process was extremely challenging. After 2 years of preparation, in March 2017, Shanghai Salvage Company officially began the salvage operation. The Zhenhua 30, a 30,000-ton capacity crane ship, successfully lifted the Sewol Ferry out of the water and transported it to port. 1,091 days after it sank, the Sewol Ferry finally saw daylight again. Following the disaster, authorities launched an investigation into the cause of the sinking. The investigation revealed that key AIS data, automatic identification system, had been lost at the time of the incident. The exact cause of the accident remains controversial, but some of the most widely accepted explanations are as follows. According to the official investigation, overloading was the direct cause of the capsizing. When the ferry made a sharp right turn, a massive amount of overloaded cargo shifted, causing a loss of balance, which led to the vessel tilting uncontrollably to the left. According to the testimony of Officer Park Han-gil, a crew member on duty at the time of the incident, she stated that when the accident occurred, she ordered the helmsman to switch the autopilot system to manual mode. At 8:48 a.m., as the ferry was preparing to turn, it suddenly lost balance, and the bow veered uncontrollably to the right. The helmsman attempted to steer left, but it was impossible. The bow abruptly swung right, causing the entire ship to tilt left. A large number of containers slid to one side and fell into the sea. By 8:53 a.m., the ferry had turned 20 degrees to the right and began drifting in a J-shaped trajectory. Strangely, the maximum cargo capacity of the Sewol Ferry was 987 tons. However, on the day of the disaster, the ferry was loaded with 182 cars, 3 large heavy-duty trucks, 3 steel water tanks, and a massive amount of steel beams. The total cargo weight reached 2,143 tons, more than twice the allowed capacity. This was a serious violation. Additionally, to accommodate the excessive cargo load, the crew violated regulations by pumping out a large amount of ballast water from the bottom of the ship. Ballast water is typically stored in ballast tanks to increase the vessel's weight and stabilize its center of gravity, ensuring the ship's stability. Without sufficient ballast water, the ship becomes prone to tilting and difficult to control. That day, the Sewol Ferry carried only 761 tons of ballast water, far below the required 1,703 tons. Furthermore, the modifications made to the ship significantly worsened the overloading issue. Before the accident, in an attempt to increase passenger capacity, the cabins on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th decks were expanded, raising the ship's center of gravity by 20 inches. This made the vessel more prone to capsizing. During the voyage, the rudder suddenly lost control, causing an excessive turn angle, which ultimately led to the catastrophe. Most maritime experts agreed that a mechanical failure was also possible. Among the surviving crew members, a helmsman named Oh Young-seok later wrote a handwritten confession letter admitting critical structural flaws in the Sewol Ferry. He wrote that the ship's hull had been altered poorly, and the bulkheads in the second cargo hold were completely ineffective in preventing water from flooding in. Once seawater entered, it only accelerated the sinking process. This theory was also explored in the documentary In the Absence. According to the ship's physics, if the ferry turned right, it should have tilted to the right. However, the Sewol Ferry tilted to the left, which led some to suspect that an external force had pulled the vessel from the front left side of its center of gravity. The documentary suggested that the ship was forcibly pulled to the left. Based on video footage from the time, the anchors on both sides of the ship were originally black before departure. However, after the accident, the paint on the left anchor had peeled off, oxidized, and turned red. This led to speculation that the left side of the ship had been artificially submerged, forcing the ferry to abruptly change course. This theory claimed that the sinking was a deliberate act by certain crew members who intentionally lowered the anchor mid-journey, triggering the disaster. However, the official Ship Investigation Committee refuted this claim, stating that the Sewol Ferry's left and right anchors remained in their retracted and secured positions, with no signs of deployment. Additionally, a test conducted by the Netherlands Maritime Institute proved that even if the anchor had been lowered, it would not have been strong enough to cause the ship to sink. Despite being widely circulated among the public, the anchor theory was ultimately dismissed. According to publicly available movement charts and radar images, some experts pointed out that at the time of the accident, a massive object was present behind the ferry. The size of this object was much larger than a standard container and appeared to be capable of changing direction on its own. This theory suggested that the Sewol Ferry became inexplicably stuck at the time of the accident due to a collision with a submarine. Additionally, survivors reported hearing a loud, unidentified noise during the incident, and other clues seemed to support this hypothesis. However, when the ferry was salvaged and brought ashore, an investigation conducted by British marine forensic firm Brooks Bell found no clear evidence of a collision on the recovered hull. In the subsequent investigation report, the possibility of an external impact was not entirely ruled out, but the final conclusion stated that the likelihood of an external collision was extremely low. If the disaster was truly caused by overloaded cargo and sudden structural modifications, then the actions of the captain, crew, and related authorities after the accident remain deeply unsettling. The question, "Why were the passengers not rescued?" became the center of public outrage. It can be said that human negligence played a significant role in the deaths of more than 300 passengers. First of all, did the captain and crew receive clear instructions to immediately assist passengers in putting on life jackets and evacuating? At the time, the ferry had not yet tilted significantly, meaning that if passengers had been evacuated in time, many lives could have been saved. Instead, the captain and crew prioritized their own escape, showing no regard for the safety of their passengers. Even after receiving evacuation orders, the crew continued telling passengers to stay put, while they secretly boarded lifeboats themselves. Captain Lee Jun-seok had been resting in his cabin when the accident occurred. After hearing a loud noise, he climbed to the top deck. When he was rescued, he was wearing only a long-sleeved shirt and shorts. In reality, he was the person most knowledgeable about the ship's condition. However, after the crew members successfully evacuated, they made no effort to assist rescue teams, failing to fulfill their responsibilities. First Officer Kang Won-sik had previously refused to carry out an evacuation order from Jindo Vessel Traffic Services, arguing that there were too many passengers on board to evacuate safely. But in reality, the Sewol Ferry was equipped with 44 small lifeboats, each capable of holding 25 people, and 4 marine evacuation systems, each capable of holding 250 people. These emergency evacuation devices could have accommodated a total of 2,100 people, while only 476 people were on board at the time of the accident. If the rescue operation had been properly organized, it would have been possible to save every single person. Yet after the accident, only 2 lifeboats were deployed. The Navigation Center repeatedly emphasized that if passengers simply jumped into the water, nearby vessels could safely rescue them. However, passengers never received such an order. Instead, they only heard repeated announcements instructing them to stay in place. The actions of the Coast Guard were extremely passive. They actively prevented civilians from approaching the scene, hindering timely rescue efforts. According to video evidence provided by the fishing vessel Jolanam Do No. 201, before the ferry capsized, the Coast Guard was nearly invisible. Only after rescuing the captain and crew members did the Coast Guard begin to appear at the scene, but they seemed unsure of what to do. Instead, fishery manager Park Sung-gi and private fishing boats that arrived later led the rescue efforts. Without their timely intervention, even more passengers would have perished. After saving the crew, one Coast Guard officer climbed through a fire hose and entered the cabin. This was the last time they used their radios to remind passengers about evacuation opportunities. However, the Coast Guard only rescued the crew and then left. The lack of coordination between government agencies was evident, with overlapping responsibilities and a failure to unify command. Meanwhile, President Park Geun-hye disappeared for 7 hours after receiving the accident report. There were rumors that she was getting cosmetic treatments at the time, while others speculated she was at a hair salon. Only she knows what she was actually doing that day. As public outrage grew, conspiracy theories involving human sacrifice began to emerge. The most widely circulated theory in South Korea linked the incident to Choi Tae-min, the leader of the Yongsan-gyo religious sect. Choi Tae-min was the father of Choi Soon-sil, who was a close friend of President Park Geun-hye. He had known Park Geun-hye for a long time before his death in 1994. According to legend, Choi Tae-min made a prophecy before his death, claiming that he would be reborn after 20 years. The Sewol Ferry disaster occurred exactly 20 years after his death. Additionally, his lunar calendar death anniversary was March 21st, while the Sewol Ferry sank on March 17th lunar calendar, a difference of only a few days. Because of this, some believed that the over 300 victims on the ferry were sacrificed to bring about Choi Tae-min's resurrection. This theory suggested that Choi Soon-sil, his daughter, orchestrated the entire event, using her friendship with President Park Geun-hye to make it happen. Rumors even spread that the president knew about the ferry sinking, but disappeared for 7 hours to conduct a ritual for Choi Tae-min. The company that owned the Sewol Ferry, Cheonghaejin Marine Commodore, and its chairman, Yoo Byung-eon, were closely tied to another religious sect, the Baptist Evangelical Church, also known as Gwanpa, a new religious movement in South Korea. As early as 1992, South Korea's Christian leadership labeled this sect as heretical. Chairman Yoo Byung-eon was a direct disciple of the sect's founder, and many crew members on the Sewol Ferry were also members of the sect. This sect was also linked to the 1987 Odaeong mass suicide case, which shocked the nation and resulted in 32 deaths. Chairman Yoo Byung-eon personally named the Sewol Ferry, and the name carried religious significance. Former Sewol Ferry captain Shin Sang-cheol had repeatedly warned the company about the ship's stability issues before the disaster, but he was suspended from his position. The company then temporarily assigned Lee Jun-seok as the acting captain for this voyage. This led to further public speculation that the Sewol Ferry disaster was a conspiracy involving President Park Geun-hye and Chairman Yoo Byung-eon. After the accident, Chairman Yoo Byung-eon was wanted for embezzlement and other charges. The police deployed 6,000 officers to track him down. On June 12, 2014, 2 months after the Sewol Ferry disaster, South Korean authorities announced that Yoo Byung-eon's body had been found in a field in Suncheon, South Jeolla Province. His body was heavily decomposed, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, dental records and DNA tests confirmed that it was indeed Chairman Yoo Byung-eon. His mysterious death only added more layers of intrigue and speculation to the entire incident. When the Sewol Ferry was salvaged, a large number of remains were discovered inside, reinforcing the sacrifice conspiracy theory among some people. Prosecutors focused on accountability for the sinking and violations of the duty to rescue passengers. A total of 399 individuals were investigated for illegal activities across 5 major areas. In November 2015, more than a year after the disaster, the case reached its final trial at the Supreme Court of South Korea, where 13 judges unanimously ruled on the verdicts. Sewol Captain Lee Jun-seok was convicted of murder with intent and sentenced to life in prison. Notably, the maximum penalty for this crime is the death sentence. However, South Korea has not carried out any executions since 1997, so his final sentence was life imprisonment. The remaining 15 crew members who were rescued received prison sentences ranging from 1 year and 6 months to 12 years. According to survivor testimonies, 3 crew members stayed on board until the very last moment, making every effort to save passengers. Unfortunately, all 3 perished while carrying out their duties. After the final trial, a total of 53 individuals were convicted, including not only the crew members, but also Coast Guard personnel, employees of Chonghaejin Marine, and other officials. Having survived such a catastrophe, the students of Danwon High School endured unimaginable psychological trauma. After some time adjusting, they eventually returned to school. Many of them could not shake off the haunting memories, frequently experiencing nightmares about the day of the disaster. Every time they walked past a familiar place on campus, they could almost see the silhouettes of their lost classmates. In January 2016, nearly 2 years after the tragedy, Danwon High School held a special graduation ceremony for the students who had perished. Their desks were filled with flowers and photographs as a tribute to those who never made it back. The surviving students, who were fortunate to live on, carried their classmates' memories forward. They traveled to Jeju Island, bringing along photos of their lost friends. Under the gentle warmth of the sun, they took pictures with their departed classmates, finally completing the trip that had been left unfinished. That concludes today's video. Let's discuss in the comments and see you in the next one.